The more you try to be seen, the more invisible you become. You feel it happening in real time, don't you? The moment you start caring just a little more, replying a little faster, showing up a little too consistently, something shifts. People don't lean in, they lean away. Conversations lose weight. Your presence becomes background noise. You think you're doing everything right, being polite, being responsive, being present. But actually, every extra effort you make is quietly lowering your position in their mind. And most people never realize this. They spend years trying to fix being ignored by doing more of the exact thing that causes it. You've probably told yourself a story to cope with it. They're just busy. Maybe I'm overthinking. It's not that deep. But deep down, you know, because patterns don't lie. When someone values you, you don't have to question it. When someone is interested, you don't feel like you're interrupting their life just by existing in it. Yet here you are, waiting, checking, adjusting yourself in silence. And that's where the damage really begins. Not in being ignored, but in how you respond to it. Because you didn't pull back. You leaned in. You tried to compensate. You became easier, more agreeable, more available. You removed friction, thinking it would make connections smoother. But what you didn't see is that friction is what creates attention. Without it, there is nothing to hold on to, nothing to chase, nothing to lose. So your presence becomes optional, replaceable, ignorable. And the worst part? It doesn't happen all at once. It's subtle, gradual, almost invisible. One delayed reply turns into two. One ignored message becomes a pattern. One-sided effort becomes the norm. Until one day, you realize you're always the one initiating, always the one maintaining, always the one trying to keep something alive that the other person stopped feeding a long time ago. And now you're stuck in a loop. If you stop trying, everything dies. If you keep trying, you lose yourself. So you choose the second option, because losing them feels worse than losing your own value. But that's exactly how the cycle tightens. The more you give without resistance, the less your presence costs. And anything that costs nothing is treated like nothing. You were never taught this. No one told you that attention is not a reward for effort. It's a reaction to perceived value. And value, in the human mind, is not built through constant availability. It's built through contrast, through tension, through the subtle possibility that you might not always be there. But you erased that possibility. You made yourself predictable, reliable in the worst way, always there, always ready, always responding. And in doing so, you removed the only thing that makes people pay attention: uncertainty. Think about it carefully. When was the last time someone felt the need to earn your time? When was the last time your absence made someone notice? When was the last time you didn't immediately close the gap? You see, people don't consciously decide to ignore you. That's the illusion. They don't wake up thinking, I'm going to devalue this person. No, it's automatic, instinctive. They respond to signals, and your behavior has been sending one clear signal over and over again. I'm always here. You don't have to work for me. And once that signal is received, everything changes. Respect lowers, curiosity fades, attention drifts. Not because you're not enough, but because you've made yourself too easy to have, too easy to predict, too easy to postpone. And here's the uncomfortable truth you've been avoiding. Being ignored is not about them. It's about the role you've allowed yourself to play. You became the constant, the background, the guaranteed presence in a world where people only truly notice what they might lose. So they don't fear losing you. And if there is no fear of loss, there is no urgency to engage. That's why you feel stuck, because effort doesn't fix this. More kindness doesn't fix this. More messages, more availability, more patience. None of it works. In fact, it makes it worse. Every extra move you make from a place of needing attention reinforces the same perception. You are there, no matter what. And once that belief is locked in, you stop being a priority. You become an option. And options are easy to ignore. But here's where it shifts. Not in what you say, not in how you explain yourself, but in what you stop doing. Because the power you lost was never taken. It was given away, piece by piece, reply by reply, adjustment by adjustment. And what you're about to understand is how to take it back. Not by forcing attention, but by changing the conditions that create it. not by chasing, but by becoming something that cannot be easily held. Because the moment you remove certainty, you reintroduce tension. And tension is where attention begins to rebuild, slowly, quietly, powerfully. But most people will never get to this point. They will stay stuck in the loop, trying harder, giving more, shrinking themselves in exchange for fragments of attention that never satisfy them. They will never question the system, never step back far enough to see the pattern. But you're here, and that means something is already different. You're starting to see that being ignored is not random. It's structured, predictable, reversible. And once you truly understand the mechanism behind it, you stop reacting emotionally and start moving strategically. Stay with this, because what comes next will change how people respond to you without you saying a single extra word. You need to understand something first, and it might irritate you because it goes against everything you've been taught. People are not ignoring you because they are bad, careless, or unaware. They are ignoring you because your behavior has made ignoring you easy, natural, and consequence-free. That's the reality you keep avoiding. You've been operating under the belief that if you show more effort, more loyalty, more consistency, people will eventually see you. But attention doesn't work like that. Attention is not a reward for effort. It's a reaction to tension. And you removed all of it. You became smooth, predictable, frictionless. And frictionless things don't hold attention. They get consumed and forgotten. That's the first fracture in your thinking. You assumed value equals effort, but in human psychology, value equals perception. And perception is shaped less by what you give, and more by how difficult it is to access you. Let that sit for a second, because if you miss that, everything else collapses. Now look at how people actually behave, not what they say. They obsess over what feels uncertain. They replay conversations when they're not sure where they stand. They check their phone when a response is delayed. Not because they're logical, but because the brain is wired to resolve tension. Uncertainty creates tension. Predictability kills it. You made yourself predictable. That's where the erosion began. You reply fast, consistently, reliably. You always show up. You never create a gap. So the other person's brain has nothing to resolve, no tension to chase, no curiosity to feed. You become mentally complete too quickly. And anything that feels complete gets mentally closed. This is why you can be kind, intelligent, even attractive, and still be ignored. Because attention is not a moral system. It doesn't reward good behavior. It responds to emotional triggers. And the strongest trigger is the possibility of loss. But you removed that possibility. You trained people, slowly and unconsciously, that no matter what they do, you will still be there. You normalized your own presence to the point where it lost weight. Think about a simple scenario you've lived through multiple times. You send a message. They take hours to respond, maybe longer. During that time, your mind starts working. You check your phone. You reread your last message. You analyze tone, timing, meaning. That's tension. That's psychological engagement. Now reverse it. They send a message. You reply instantly. There is no gap, no question, no space for their mind to wander. You gave them closure immediately, and closure ends engagement. Do this enough times and a pattern forms. You are the one who waits. They are the one who is waited for. That imbalance becomes the new normal. Not because they consciously decided it, but because your behavior made it efficient. Humans always move toward efficiency. If they learn they can invest less and still receive your attention, they will. Not out of malice, but out of instinct. And now you're stuck in a structure where you give more than you receive. And the more you try to fix it, the deeper you sink. Because your instinct tells you to compensate, to give more, to show more interest, to prove your value. But that instinct is exactly what destroys your position. Because every action coming from, I need to be noticed, lowers perceived value. Need is visible, even when you try to hide it. It leaks through timing, through tone, through consistency. And once someone senses that you need their attention more than they need yours, the dynamic shifts permanently. You stop being an equal. You become a source of validation, of attention, of emotional availability. And sources are used, not chased. This is where most people break, because they think the solution is to become better at giving, more interesting, more engaging, more impressive. But the truth is colder than that. The issue was never what you gave. It was that you gave it without resistance, without limit, without making it something that had to be earned. You collapsed the entire structure of tension. So now, if you want to reverse this, you don't start by adding more. You start by removing. The first rule is simple, but difficult to execute because it goes against your impulses. You stop reacting immediately. Not as a tactic, but as a correction. You break the pattern you've trained into others. When you feel the urge to reply instantly, you pause. You let the message sit. Not to manipulate, but to rebuild space. Space creates uncertainty, and uncertainty reactivates attention. The moment your timing becomes less predictable, their mind starts adjusting. Why didn't they reply yet? That question is the beginning of regained value. But if you do this inconsistently, it won't work. Because inconsistency still signals availability. You need controlled unpredictability, not chaos, not games, control. You decide when you engage, not your impulses. That's the difference. The second rule cuts deeper. You detach from the outcome. This is where most fail because they're still emotionally tied to being noticed. You're still checking if they replied, still measuring your worth through their response speed, their tone, their attention. As long as you're doing that, you're not in control. You're reacting. And reaction is always lower status than initiation. You need to reach a point where your behavior is not dictated by their response. You reply because you choose to, not because you're waiting. That shift is subtle, but powerful. Because when you stop orbiting around their attention, your energy changes. You become grounded, less eager, less reactive, and people feel that. They may not consciously understand it, but they adjust to it. Because now, there's a possibility. You might not always be there. And that possibility is what reintroduces tension. The third rule is where everything consolidates. You become selectively unavailable. Not fake busy, not pretending, but genuinely unavailable to things that don't meet your standard. This requires something most people avoid: standards. Because having standards means you're willing to walk away. And most people would rather be half-valued than alone. So they tolerate low attention, low effort, low respect. And by tolerating it, they reinforce it. You need to reverse that. Your time is not something you hand out freely anymore. Your attention is not automatic. When someone delays, you don't compensate. When someone gives minimal effort, you don't overinvest. You mirror selectively, not emotionally. That's control. And control creates respect. Over time, this reshapes how people interact with you. Not because you demanded it, but because the structure changed. You removed the guarantee. You introduced the possibility of loss. And now, their brain has something to resolve again. Something to think about. Something to pay attention to. This is the part most people misunderstand. You're not trying to make people like you more. You're changing the conditions under which they perceive you. And perception drives behavior, always. You were never lacking value. You were leaking it. Through over-availability, through predictability, through emotional dependency on attention. And once you close those leaks, something interesting happens. You don't just stop being ignored. You start being noticed without trying. Because attention naturally flows toward what feels slightly out of reach, slightly uncertain, slightly hard to lock down. That's where curiosity lives. That's where engagement builds. And that's where your presence starts to carry weight again. But this only works if you commit to the shift fully. If you half apply it, people will feel the inconsistency and default back to the old pattern. You need to become someone whose time is structured, whose attention is intentional, whose presence is not guaranteed. Not aggressively, not dramatically, quietly, consistently. That's what changes everything. Because at the end of the day, people don't ignore you because you're not enough. They ignore you because your behavior made it safe to do so. And the moment it stops being safe, they start paying attention again. Everything comes down to this. Attention is never about how much you give. It is about how much your presence can be lost. And you've been living as if your presence is permanent, guaranteed, endlessly accessible. And that is why it has been treated as something disposable. You kept believing that if you just tried a little harder, stayed a little longer, gave a little more of yourself, people would finally recognize your value. But what you didn't see is that every extra step you took toward them pushed you further away from yourself. And once that happens, people don't need to ignore you. You disappear on your own. This is the truth most people will never have the discipline to accept. The world does not respond to effort. It responds to perceived consequence. And when there is no consequence to losing you, there is no reason to hold on to you. You made it easy for people to delay you, to deprioritize you, to treat your time like something that can be picked up later, because you never created a moment where your absence actually meant something. You were always there to close the gap, always there to smooth over silence, always there to keep things alive even when the other side stopped investing. And in doing that, you removed the only pressure that forces people to show up, uncertainty mixed with the risk of loss. So now, if you want to change this, not temporarily, not as a tactic, but permanently, you have to understand that this is not about controlling others. It is about restructuring yourself in a way that makes low attention incompatible with your presence. You are no longer the person who fills empty space just because it's uncomfortable. You are no longer the person who responds out of impulse just to feel seen. You are no longer the person who over-explains, over-invests, or overextends just to maintain a connection that is already collapsing. You cut that pattern at the root. And this is where it becomes uncomfortable, because reclaiming your value does not feel like empowerment at first. It feels like loss. You will feel the silence you used to avoid. You will feel the distance you used to close. You will feel the urge to go back to your old behavior just to relieve the tension. But that tension is exactly what you need to hold, because that tension is where your power rebuilds. Most people fail here because they confuse discomfort with something being wrong. But in this case, discomfort is the signal that something is finally changing. You are breaking a pattern that trained people to ignore you, and any pattern that has been reinforced over time will resist when you try to shift it. But if you stay consistent, something precise begins to happen. People start noticing the gap. Not dramatically, not instantly, but subtly. The timing changes, the energy shifts, the dynamic rebalances. Because now, your presence is no longer predictable. It is no longer guaranteed. And once that guarantee disappears, attention has to recalibrate. This is the rule you need to carry forward. If you want to be valued, you must become someone who cannot be easily accessed, easily understood, or easily replaced. Not by playing games, not by pretending, but by having a structure to your time, your attention, and your energy that does not bend just because someone else is inconsistent. You don't reward low effort with high investment anymore. You don't chase clarity from people who give you confusion. You don't try to prove your worth to someone who benefits from you doubting it. That entire framework collapses. And when it does, something shifts inside you that people can feel without you saying a word. You stop seeking attention, and you start carrying presence. And presence is different. Presence is felt in how you respond, in how you pause, in how you don't rush to fill space, in how you can walk away without needing closure. That is what creates weight. That is what creates gravity. And people are naturally pulled toward gravity. But here is the part that separates you from everyone else who hears this and does nothing with it. You don't apply this selectively when it's convenient. You become it completely. Because if you only act this way when you feel strong, and then revert the moment you feel ignored again, you reset the entire pattern. Consistency is what locks in perception, and perception is what drives behavior. So you stay consistent, even when it's quiet, even when nothing seems to be changing yet, even when your mind tries to convince you that you should go back to chasing, just to feel something again. You don't. You hold the line. Because now you understand something most people never will. Attention is not something you ask for. It is something that emerges when your absence becomes noticeable. And absence only becomes noticeable when your presence was never guaranteed in the first place. That is the shift. That is the mechanism. And once you internalize it, you stop reacting emotionally to being ignored. And you start seeing it as feedback, as data, as a reflection of how your current behavior is being interpreted. And that gives you control. Real control. Not over people, but over how people experience you. And when you control that, everything else adjusts automatically. Most people will never reach this level of awareness because it requires them to let go of the comfort of being needed in small, inconsistent ways and replace it with the discipline of being respected in fewer, more intentional ways. They will choose immediate validation over long-term value. They will choose attention that is easy over attention that is earned. And because of that, they will stay in the same cycle, overgiving, overthinking, being overlooked, and repeating it until it feels normal. But you don't have to stay there. You can step out of that loop completely, not by forcing the world to see you, but by becoming someone who is no longer available to be unseen. That is the difference. That is the line most people never cross. So if you want to be noticed, if you want to be respected, if you want your presence to carry weight again, you must accept this final rule without negotiation. You stop offering yourself where you are not being valued, even if it means facing silence, even if it means letting things end, even if it means standing alone for a while, because standing alone with your value intact is always more powerful than being surrounded and ignored. And once you truly understand that, not intellectually but behaviorally, you don't need to chase attention ever again. It comes to you, not because you demanded it, but because you became someone it cannot ignore. Now read this again, not to feel motivated, but to recognize every place in your life where you've been giving yourself away without resistance, and start removing it piece by piece, until what remains is something that cannot be easily accessed, easily predicted, or easily forgotten.